Holincheck. You might have run across him as a Gartner analyst for multiple years in the HCM arena. There is no higher order of knighthood in HCM than being a Gartner analyst. He went on to work for Workday, and now he's joined forces with Jason Averbook as an analyst and consultant for HCM and this new idea of the digital experience, and following Jason's theory of taking HR to a new level. And Jim was anxious to volunteer to come and see what LEHRN was all about, and I said, heck, come and present. So I asked him, Jim, can you tell us just for a minute, how does a person become a Gartner analyst? And how did you end up doing that work? And we're excited to have you today, and the theme of his presentation is avoiding application fatigue. What do you do with SaaS and cloud software that delivers dozens, if not hundreds, of implementable updates a year? How do you decide what to do and when to do it, and how do you build a strategy that doesn't exhaust you? So, Jim, glad to have you, and tell us, how did you become a Gartner analyst?
Okay. All right. So, in terms of agenda, just to set the expectation, I'm going to answer that question. And thanks for having me here today. I was really looking forward to being part of the program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am and answer Matt's question, and a little bit about Leapgen and what we do, but spend most of the time really on giving you a little historical context really quickly about sort of how we got to some of the challenges we face today with what Matt described, and then talk about some things that I've seen that have been effective with organizations in terms of how they manage the complexity of the environments they have today and the amount of change that's happening in terms of the software that they're working with. And so, let's see if I can use this correctly. Yes, I can. So here's all the bio information. I don't think we have a hashtag for today for Twitter. We probably should think about having a hashtag in the future for those of you who are into social media. But you can find me on Twitter there and on LinkedIn. So Matt asked, how do you become a Gartner analyst? And so I actually started my career at what's now Accenture. Back then was Anderson Consulting. Actually, I even joined before Anderson Consulting was a separate business unit of Arthur Anderson. I joined a group there called Software Intelligence. And the group had a very specific mission. And my educational background was I had a BS in electrical engineering and an MBA. And what this group did, though, is focus exclusively on financials and HR software. And we helped the firm in a few different ways. So we would install those products on computers that the firm had and develop training for them, for the consultants. So we did all of our sort of internal training. And if you're familiar with that organization today, they still like to do a lot of their own sort of training around software products, but that started way back in the day. We also did evaluations of different markets. So as the firm was going out doing software selection projects, they would use the materials that our group developed as a sort of starting point or springboard for those software selections. And then, me personally, I actually started on the financial side, doing financials implementations for about 5 years, and then I got promoted to manager, and all the managers that we had doing HCM left the firm. PeopleSoft was just becoming a thing at that point, and there were a lot of opportunities both actually working at PeopleSoft and working at companies that were implementing PeopleSoft, and so there was a void, and I was the newest kid on the block, and so I decided to do HCM. And I did a PeopleSoft 4.0 implementation. For those of you who can think that far back, that was
3.5.
Oh, okay, there you go. But after that, did a lot of strategy and software selection work, and then a headhunter called me and came to me about an opportunity with a small company called Giga Information Group. And Giga was started by Gideon Gartner, who's the person who started Gartner, G-I-G-A. so Gideon and Gartner. And it was bigger than Meta. So for those of you who knew what Meta Group used to be, that was sort of part of the charm of the name. And that was really my first analyst gig. And Giga actually eventually got acquired by Forrester. So some of you may know Paul Hammerman. So when I left to do a startup from Giga, Paul replaced me there. And Paul eventually went on and just retired actually this year as an analyst at Forrester, covering this market. I did a startup, it failed, but I was fortunate at that time, as it was sort of tanking, that Jenny Lehman, who was sort of the key analyst at Gartner covering HCM at the time, went to PeopleSoft, ironically enough, to lead product strategy there. And so an opening came up, and I happened to have a pretty good background from my previous analyst gig to do it. And so that's how I got to Gartner. And when I was at Gartner, one of the things that I found, so I was there from 2002 to 2012. And if you think about sort of that time frame, it was sort of the rise of cloud applications in HCM, especially around talent management. And we did quite a bit of research around that at that time. And one of the things I found was that the vendors who got to be very significant in that space, they, when they had a few hundred customers, they had really high customer satisfaction. And customers were really well engaged with them. But as they got into the thousands of customers, it became a lot harder for them. And we saw vendors really struggling with keeping that customer satisfaction up. The other thing that sort of happened towards the end of that decade was we really started to see the core applications start to move to the cloud as well. And really from like 2009 to when I left to join one of them at Workday, that was another sort of trend that was happening, and that growth was just starting to take off at that time. And what I wanted to do and started to do ultimately at Workday was focus on what happens after a customer goes live. And when I joined Workday, and what I saw when I was working with a lot of the talent management vendors was that there was a lot of focus on getting customers live. And how do we shorten the implementation cycle to really do that? How do we keep the cost down? Because that was a real barrier to change. But not nearly as much thought on what happens when you go live. And so that's why I want to set a little bit of the historical context with you today and talk about that, because the cloud sort of solved some problems, but it also created new ones in terms of how customers think about that experience. And so a little bit about Leapgen. We are a firm that does workforce technology strategy consulting, but we also think about it from that sort of full life cycle perspective. So not just developing the strategy, but help you sort of bridge the strategy and execution gap. So you come up with a strategy. How do you actually enable the change that happens in your organization? And how do you sustain and innovate and optimize over time? And so that's sort of what we do. And we're going to continue to evolve the services that we offer. We got some exciting things that we're going to be announcing soon along those lines. And so stay tuned there. And just the context. So this isn't all the reasons why the cloud won. And if you have questions or thoughts throughout this, Matt said, and I know he'll interrupt, but feel free to interrupt me if you want. One thing I saw in the on-premises world was that vendors would come out with new releases every 2 to 3 years, right? But customers would maybe upgrade those every 4 to 6 years, right? They'd skip a release because it was this major hassle to do the upgrade project. And oftentimes, even in that 4 to 6 year period, they do a quote-unquote technical upgrade, right? And so they wouldn't get any new functionality out of it. And it was really what sort of opened the door for these cloud talent management vendors to come in and sell into organizations was they couldn't get it from their core providers because they were too locked in terms of that upgrade cycle. And the cloud helps solve that, right? I mean, today, most vendors, you don't see too many doing monthly releases anymore, but it's often, every 2 to 4 releases a year is pretty common. So the cloud really solved the problem in terms of being able to have new functionality available to you that you could choose to take on. The other thing that happened, especially later 2000s, really this decade, is that different devices became a big thing, right? So we wanted to be able to have employees and managers and users be able to use their mobile devices, use their laptops, use whatever, to be able to access these applications. And so the cloud was is more nimble, if you will, for vendors to be able to react to that, be able to bring on different and new user experiences, on new devices, and that really wasn't easily done in the on-premises world. And then it was just sort of the relationship with customers. So I don't know how many times I saw when I was an analyst at Gartner, customers complaining about the contracts that they have with the vendors, and the vendors don't really care, and they just want to nickel and dime me and get more money out of me all the time for new stuff. And and when they sold you the software, they pretty much threw it over the wall, right? And so you'd be responsible for implementing it. A partner, you could contract with the vendor to do it. And then once you were live, you're really pretty much on your own unless you were engaging with professional services on an ongoing basis. And software as a service is different, right? They're running the software for you. They have to provide a good level of service on a daily basis. We've seen much more prominence around things like customer success emerging out at vendors today, and working with customers on an ongoing basis, and really having to, at a minimum, you have this point every 3 to 4 years typically, where they have to basically renew you, for the business model to work. And so, as opposed to the maintenance contracts that you were sort of locked into previously. And so, what's different now? It was great to get access to all that new functionality, but for many organizations, it was too much. I know when I first started at Workday, we were doing 3 releases a year, and we were hearing from customers, that's too much. And so we ended up changing it actually to be 2 releases a year. And even that, as the product portfolio grew, became even more challenging for customers to support. And as we all know, you don't have just one solution, right? You have many solutions for all your needs around human capital management. And so you just sort of multiply that together in terms of the numbers of new features that are coming at you all the time from those vendors. So instead of having a scarcity problem in terms of not being able to get access to new features to really help improve what you're doing, now you have an overabundance of features, and you're trying to prioritize and figure out what you really want to take advantage of. The other thing is that even though we were meeting the users where they were, it's still, we got feedback, and I've even experienced this more since I've joined Leapgen, is that it's still too hard for employees and managers to do certain things, especially things that they do infrequently. And so even though we've improved the user experience for organizations, there's still a lot more to do in terms of workforce experience, especially for those infrequent times, especially we call them moments that matter at Leapgen. You're having a baby, you're getting a promotion, you're not having those experiences every day, right? And making sure that you're prepared as you get promoted into a new role and are going to be effective at it. It's more than just doing the transactions, right? And I think that's, we've gotten good at doing the transactions, we've got good at exposing them through a variety of different channels, but that experience is still something that is not quite there yet. And I heard this one a lot at Workday. I don't know what I don't know. So one of the byproducts of really trying to compress the initial implementations of products was that you have to make a lot of decisions quickly about how you're going to use the software. And sometimes you don't know sort of the implications of those decisions until you're live. And sometimes your consultants maybe didn't educate you as much as what you needed to do. And so even though service has gotten better generally, I would say, there's still a lot more that customers need in terms of being more self-sufficient and not needing as much consultative help to be effective. And so, so those are some of the challenges that we're seeing today. And I know that each of you are going to be sort of in different places, like in terms of where you are on your journey. So some may be out there looking at a new cloud core HR system. I was talking to somebody at the break who is about to embark on that journey relatively soon. Some of you may already have them in place. I know a number of you in the room already do, and you're relatively mature in terms of what you have with a cloud portfolio, and probably have pretty good practices in place. I know some of the customers in the room, I know for sure they do, because I've worked with them in the past. But I think the thing I would sort of stress is that, regardless of where you're at on the journey, one thing that you want to make sure of is that you have a strong understanding of what your strategy and vision is. Where are you really trying to go? And it's something that I think a lot of people think about it as a one-off type of project sometimes, but it really is something that you want to revisit on a relatively regular basis, at least on an annual type of basis. The other thing I would say is that a lot of times you have fatigue when you go live. We call it go begin at Leapgen. I'm sure you've heard Jason talk about that in the past, right? And but that's really when you're going to start realizing the value from your investment. So you can take a quick pause, certainly, but you want to make sure that you start putting the processes in place to allow you to get that value once you're live. And so we'll talk a little bit about that too. I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on run, optimize, and innovate, because that's really the part that I'm very passionate about, because that's really what I saw in my Gartner experience that was lacking. And so I want to try and give some tips around that. But let's start with the vision and strategy. And you don't need to necessarily read this. This is a sample of what we call a vision map at Leapgen. But I want to point out sort of the elements of it as you're thinking about making sure you can articulate the vision well that you have in your organization and how it ties to your strategy. So the most obvious thing is a vision statement, right? So it sort of tells you what your aspirations are in terms of what you're trying to accomplish as an HR organization. It's supported by guiding principles, right? And so the guiding principles are really sort of the signposts, if you will, that as you're making decisions about technology, about programs, about whatever, that you keep those in mind in terms of making those decisions. And the vision and guiding principles sort of lead you to what kind of experience, how is it going to feel when you actually are achieving that vision in your organization. And this gets a little bit to the workforce experience side of things. How do you want your employees to feel when they're having a baby? I'm sure you want them to enter all the transactional stuff they need to do, but how do you really want them to feel? Right? You want them to feel appreciated. You want them to understand that when they come back, that there's going to be a place for them, and that you're going to help them with that transition back. And so it's more than just the capturing of the data and doing the transactions that you're trying to think about as part of your vision. Technology can help enable it, and we see a lot of organizations interested in leveraging technology to do that, but it really starts with what type of experience you're trying to deliver. And then it's really not something to manage if you can't measure, right? So how do you know that you're going in the right direction in terms of delivering on that vision and delivering the experience that you want to have? And that's where that comes into play. And so if you haven't sort of thought through your vision in that way, you sort of aren't necessarily ready to think about how technology is going to help enable it. And you may have great technology assets in place, but maybe you're not leveraging them in the best way that you could in terms of where you're trying to get to. And that really leads you to a roadmap. And we heard, I think Mick, when he was up here from Lifetime, was talking about the roadmap that they have built. And you'd be surprised how many customers out there sort of do it on an ad hoc type of basis. They don't have a plan, if you will, and not everybody needs a 3-year plan, and this is just a sample style of roadmap. There's a lot of different ways you can do a roadmap. But the point is that if you have that good vision, you have the metrics, you have the guiding principles, you know what experience you're trying to deliver, then you want to have a set of projects and initiatives that are going to help you get to that point, right? And leverage the technology that you have or will have to get there. And what we found in my past life working with customers at Workday is that some of the ones that were the most successful, they didn't just build a roadmap once, or they just didn't build the roadmap and update it maybe annually. Most of them were coming back and looking at it like quarterly. So seeing what was coming from the vendors that they were working with, looking at the changes that were happening in their business, and making adjustments to the priorities that were on that roadmap, and because that really sort of guides you in terms of where you need to focus, and what you need to resource, and where you need to have budget, and where you may be able to leverage or need new technology. It's also about having the right skills, and I think this is something that's changed over time. Especially as we start thinking more about experience. So things like design thinking. We did this survey, and this was the part actually that scared me about Kyle's presentation. So I have 2 of these types of charts in my presentation. So I don't know if I did them right. I'm like second guessing myself. Did I present them correctly? I think we did a pretty good job on this in terms of following his guidelines, but you never want to follow that kind of presentation when you have these types of charts, right?
Jim, could you talk a little bit about what design thinking is? Not all of us really have internalized what it really means.
To me, it really is about sort of having empathy for the user. I was talking about experience before. It's a way of trying to put yourselves in the shoes of the different personas. You'll hear the word persona thrown around this, and in terms of what they're doing, how they're feeling, and designing a solution that meets that, and at a very high level. We could do a whole design thinking workshop.
We will.
You probably should. We probably should. The other thing I would say is that we talked about data analysis, obviously, with Kyle's presentation. It's a skill that a lot of organizations also feel like they're lacking. This was from a survey that Leapgen did in conjunction with Unleash, the Unleash organization that runs one of the HR technology conferences. And the point is that as you're thinking about sort of what the makeup of your organization is and what kinds of skills you want to have in place, as you're thinking about sort of the new vision or the next vision or the vision update you're doing, also think about the skills that you have in place and what you might want to augment. Be it analytic skills, be it, we heard a need for project management skills earlier, and a lot of organizations are thinking about that along agile types of lines, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's important to have sort of the right composition of skills, either directly in your organization or working with partners that can help supplement that.
Jim, what are the skills in release management? What do people need to know to manage releases better?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about release management in a couple of slides, but in a nutshell, it's sort of a newer role I found for organizations, but again, with all the new capabilities that are coming at you, and many of the vendors offering sort of a preview, if you will, of the new functionality, you're sort of trying to assess how you update your roadmap, if you're doing more of an agile type of approach, how you're doing your own releases of capabilities internally. And it's basically managing that process from when you learn about what the new set of features are going to be to evaluating which ones you want to take on, to understanding the impact of those features, because some may be opt-in, but others may be things that are automatically available to you that may impact what your current environment looks like, to updating the roadmap and release plans to take into account what's coming in a particular release. And so Those are the kinds of things that are going on. So it's really a planning role. It's working with the business to understand their priorities relative to the new stuff that's coming in. And again, this may be from multiple vendors that you're working with in your portfolio. And so, they help coordinate those types of activities and make sure that, your plan around releases, supports what you're doing with your roadmap.
Can I say that was a wonderful answer?
Thanks.
I was unfamiliar with release management. That really makes sense.
Yeah, I know at the last set of risings I went to at Workday, we have this thing at Workday called brain dates. If you're a Workday customer, you may know what those are. And that was like the most popular question I talked to customers about, was about release management and release managers. Because some of them were like new to being in the role, and they sort of didn't know exactly what to do. And some of them, especially if they were doing phased rollouts, were sort of, how do I factor in the fact that we're not fully live yet with the fact that we're getting all these new features while we're continuing to roll out? So there's a lot of complexity that can be involved in the role.
Can you do a workshop on that?
All right, I talked a little bit about go live equals go begin earlier. I want to talk about sort of after you go live and you start beginning. We call it the sustainment phase here, and ongoing change management. And this was actually a slide we already had on our deck, and I'm like scratching my head and saying, what does that really mean? Ongoing change management. I mean, I talked about some of the changes already, right? In terms of you have all this new stuff coming at you, but the reality is you've also deployed a bunch of stuff, right? And that's sort of the last bit here. It supports continued user adoption, and Jason likes to use the term addiction in a lot of his presentations. And if you think about that, it can have a positive or negative connotation to some extent. But in this context, what we really mean is that you want your workforce to want to use your stuff, right? You want them to be so enamored of what you've delivered in terms of service and experience that they want to keep coming back for more, which is sort of like what addiction is, but without maybe the negative connotations. But I think one of the things that we found, and it was interesting to see Roberta's presentation about this, is that I find a lot of organizations don't understand what their adoption is. So one of the things she was talking about with her product is that she's going to be able to give employers information about how their workforce is using her product, right? And if you think about it today, in the context especially of human capital management applications, there's a lot of data that's captured in the system about adoption, but it's not always easy to get it out. And I'm going to give a kudo to Thomson Reuters on this one. I really started, when I moved over to product management at Workday, I started a team called Adoption, Workday Adoption. And at Rising a few years ago, some folks from Thomson Reuters gave a presentation on what they called custom usage metrics at the time. And it was just a fantastic presentation. So all the good stuff that you saw Kyle talk about in terms of data visualization, they have a team that sort of mined the Workday data to pull out those types of insights and be able to provide them to stakeholders internally, and they talked about how they did that. And part of what we were doing when I was running that organization at Workday was start to build out package usage metrics more to help make those same types of analyses, if you will. And the kinds of things that we were looking at and what Thomson Reuters was looking at with their custom usage metrics was things like device logins. So what are they using? Are they using mobile? So you've made mobile available. Are people using it? And then what are they using it for? So you have self-service applications. Do you know how many employees are initiating time off or entering time via mobile device? Do you know, and getting back to Kyle's presentation, do you know the different dimensions of it? Do you know, is it different by organization? Is it different by location? Is it different by demographics in your workforce? So maybe the younger folks tend to use the mobile devices more than the older folks. A lot of this data is in your system, and you probably aren't using it. At least that's what I found. how many folks can sort of, besides Thomson Reuters, is doing that kind of thing with their HR system today, really understanding how their workforce is using the applications that they've put out there. So I've got a couple of hands, okay. But this is what I found. There are some organizations that have really taken it upon themselves to do that, and this is an area I think the vendor community needs to step up more and do more in terms of providing out-of-the-box capabilities around it. The other thing, so that's really device usage, process participation. You spend a lot of money creating reports, dashboards in the solutions. Are managers using them? Right? Pretty simple question. What we found as we mined some of the data overall at Workday is that maybe not as much as what we thought customers would do. And again, are they using them on mobile devices? How are they using them? It's the same sort of analysis. Yeah.
Just a quick comment. Another thought I had on this is, has the company even turned on the option?
Right. Yeah, and that's another one, right? I mean, you may own it, but you haven't turned it on. Or there may be new features that have been delivered. Are you aware of them? There may be an existing feature that's been improved, right? Do you know that it's been improved, and do you know what it takes to take advantage of that? And that's sort of some of the release management stuff that I was talking about, is that's part of what you're trying to evaluate, right? Is there something we haven't taken advantage of that we should that's going to increase user adoption or addiction, hopefully, in a good sense. You can see some of these other things, click data. So is the reason they're struggling to initiate a process or complete a process is because it's too many clicks. They just get bogged down. And you see this a lot in recruiting, right? If it's too many things that I have to enter and go through, people don't finish applying to jobs. They drop off. And it's the same kind of thing really around any process. And in addition to sort of feedback and sentiment type of data, we see surveys around employee NPS, Net Promoter Score, focus groups. Those are other good sort of data points to sort of triangulate around what the experience is like. But this is a whole sort of area that really hasn't been explored as much as it should. But in terms of really getting to the bottom of what the experience is in a data-driven way, we think is critical. And then, I said I was going to come back to release management. A couple of things I would highlight here, though, in addition to just release management, is that I talked about run, optimize, innovate. So we've talked a little bit about the running. We've talked a little bit about the optimization in terms of looking at those opportunities with new features and looking at your data in terms of where you may have opportunities to optimize. The innovation piece, that takes sort of a little bit of extra effort, right? And what we've seen be successful out there is this whole idea of an HR innovation team that's sort of looking at some of these newer types of things. So we talked about chatbots earlier, right? Maybe you're not ready to deploy chatbots. Maybe your vendors you're working with aren't ready to deploy it in the way that you want to look at it in your organization, but maybe it's something you should be experimenting with. And maybe working with a focus group of employees, getting feedback on how do you apply it in your organization. Or finding use cases where maybe it's internal to the HR organization, they're trying it out, maybe it's part of their shared service center to help service center employees be more effective, just as an example. But my point is that having, and I know this is harder in smaller organizations, but we've seen in larger organizations, having some dedicated resource around playing with all the great technology innovations that are coming around can be super advantageous as you think about what kind of experience you can provide in the future, as well as what your roadmap looks like in terms of getting there. And in terms of the release management, one thing we didn't sort of talk about is was around I didn't go into too much detail in terms of the release cycle, but part of release planning is things like regression testing. It's not sexy stuff, but again, when you did in the on-premises world, it was a big project. You'd have this big phase that was regression testing. Now you're having to do it on a regular basis, and so figuring out what you really need to test versus not test. Where do you trust that the vendor's done what they're supposed to do? Have you been able to evaluate it during a preview window so that you're comfortable that when that release goes into production, you're going to be good and not have any disruption? That's a big part of what happens as part of release planning. And so I want to make sure I mentioned that. Guess any questions about release planning? I know I did it a little bit, sort of broken up, or release management. Okay.
How many companies are really doing it well? 10%, 20%?
Well, I mean, everybody's doing it, whether they like it or not. The vendors are coming out with new releases. Either you're actively doing it or it's passively happening to you. And your release management strategy is their release management, right? Where we've seen organizations be, I think, more successful is when they've been more proactive. And the other thing that's been happening, I focused on the big feature releases, but on a weekly basis for many vendors, you get updates, you get patches. In some cases, you'll get new functionality as well, especially for newer products from the vendor, where customers need that faster to be able to adopt and go live. You'll see off-cycle features delivered. You need to keep up with that too. So it's not just about the big feature release that happens, but you have this weekly cadence of new stuff that's coming at you. And again, this is part of what release managers do as well, is sort of sift through that and see what actions do we need to take, who needs to make a decision about something. And what I found is a lot of times customers are inconsistent about that, but the ones who are most successful are the ones who stay on top of it, who have a regular set of meetings, a regular sort of process in place for how they take in that information, process it, make decisions, and execute. And so that's, and again, we're not talking just one product, we're talking across whatever your portfolio of products are to do that.
So Matt, example is that with us, for the compensation, we have a weekly meeting every Monday to go through what was released in Workday, whether it was something in preview, whether it was something directly in production, review those items, determine if we need a regression test, determine if it's what to do within the functionality, is it put in the parking lot, what are we going to go through with that stuff?
Just do you document all this in Excel, or how do you manage it?
We go through, they have a what's new, we go through it, we have a documentation in Excel that we keep track of, follow up with, take action on it.
The last thing I worked on at Workday was actually something called adoption planning, which was a module in Workday that basically integrated with what's new to allow you to be able to track that stuff in the product. And so you could sort of decide how you wanted to disposition all the. We never got it to do patch notes, which was sort of a mess that we eventually wanted to include. But for any new feature stuff,
You designed it for how many rows?
How many rows?
Yeah,
that was
hundreds, thousands. I mean, what is
when I left, the biggest customer had more than 1,000 items that they were tracking. Yeah.
Obviously, this isn't necessarily Workday specific, right? You've got multiple applications that don't like, but you do this more to utilize decision trackers. It's very easy to use for customers if they're used to using it in a consistent way, whether it's quarterly, every 6 weeks, however often the releases are coming through. Once you have a repeatable process, it becomes very easy to do.
And I think that's really the key. It's not sort of what solution you use to track it. It's having the process in place. Mondays was absolutely the most popular day for Workday customers to do this because of when the weekly updates happen. But your vendors are going to be on different schedules too. So you have to do it sort of according to what their schedules are. And I think that was a great point. Having a consolidated view of it is also key. So you understand the trade-offs, dependencies, and so I think there's this conception when you're first starting down the cloud road that the vendor's going to do all these updates for me, and I really don't have to think about that too much. And the reality is you probably have to think about it more than what you did in the on-premise world because it's coming at you so fast. And so that if you're not doing that today, or you're just embarking down that path like I talked about earlier in terms of cloud solutions to a large extent, then these are the kinds of things you want to be starting to think about in terms of process. And I just want to talk quickly about Agile. You know, so if you think about what we just talked about, right, for these weekly updates, this is sort of where Agile really can be super helpful because, you know, you have sort of this, you know, review of information and sort of disposition of tasks, if you will, that you need to do, and how do you sort of act on them, and how do you do that in the context of, you know, delivering new features and other things that are going on that you want to do to provide, you know, new reports, new dashboards, or whatever.